before we step into the fate of Prince Leopold, it is necessary to pause and confront a grim truth: the obsession with blood purity that haunted Europe's thrones. For centuries, royal families regarded marriage not as an affair of the heart, but as a weapon of statecraft. A cousin, a niece, sometimes even an uncle. These were not forbidden choices, but expected ones. Dynasties sought to secure alliances, concentrate wealth, and above all, preserve what they called blue blood. But the price of this gamble was steep. Over time, what was meant to safeguard power became a silent curse. The same surnames tangled together, generation after generation, until the family trees resembled twisted knots more than proud lineages. Across Europe, whispers spread of children born weak, princes with fragile minds, princesses who never reached adulthood. History remembers the Habsburg jaw, a grotesque protrusion of the lower face that became the family's signature deformity. Hemophilia, called the royal disease, seeped across Europe through Queen Victoria's descendants, turning even minor wounds into death sentences. And in Spain, Charles II, the last of the Habsburg line, grew into a tragic specter of monarchy itself. A man so crippled by inbreeding that his body seemed less a throne of kingship than a testament to dynastic decay. These stories were not distant to the rulers of Roenberg, whose gray towers stood like iron against the horizon in the late 18th century. Within those walls, King Frederick VI's carried a heavy burden. 3 marriages had passed without producing a living heir. Each bride had been tied to him by blood, as was custom. Each had failed him, as if the dynasty itself was crumbling under the weight of its own choices. By the spring of 1785, his 4th wife, Isabella of Saxony-Coburg, was in labor. The future of the von Wittmann line hung on her strength. The palace corridors shook with anticipation. Servants darted between chambers, candles burned low, and the king's footsteps echoed endlessly as he paced. Frederick was not a young man, and the crown weighed heavier with every year of uncertainty. If Isabella failed, the dynasty might fracture, its centuries-old legacy slipping into the hands of rival claimants. At last, a door creaked open. The royal physician entered, bowing low. "It is a boy, Your Majesty," he said, but though his words should have carried triumph, his tone was heavy, almost mournful. Frederick rushed into the chamber. Isabella lay pale against the pillows, her hair damp with sweat, her arms wrapped protectively around a tiny bundle. She kissed the child's forehead before reluctantly surrendering him to the king. Frederick's eyes softened, then hardened as he unwrapped the silk. The infant's face bore the noble features of his ancestors, a perfect miniature of his lineage, until his gaze shifted downward. The boy's legs were twisted, bent unnaturally as if snapped by some unseen cruelty. The silence in the room became suffocating. Dr. von Miller, one of the few men at court who dared speak plainly to the king, cleared his throat. "Majesty, the prince suffers a congenital deformity of the lower limbs, most likely a consequence of consanguinity." The word struck like a blade. Consanguinity, the polite term for generations of marrying cousins. Frederick froze. He had married Isabella knowing she was his second cousin, convinced it would tighten dynastic bonds. Now, staring at his newborn son, he saw the price carved into fragile flesh. "Will he live?" the king whispered. The physician's reply was careful but firm. "If he survives the first months, yes, but the deformity is permanent." The chamber seemed to tilt under the weight of destiny. Courtiers lowered their heads, servants trembled in silence. Only Isabella, her voice trembling yet resolute, whispered, "He is ours. He will live." Frederick's jaw clenched. At last, he returned the child to her arms. "He shall be named Leopold, after my father, and he will rule after me." His words rang with defiance, as if he could will strength into fragile bones. That night, heralds proclaimed the joyous news across the capital. A healthy heir, strong and noble, had been born. But behind gilded words, the truth lay hidden. Alone in his library, Frederick studied the sprawling family tree stretched across his desk, its branches intertwined like a suffocating web, names repeated endlessly, the same blood woven tighter and tighter until it strangled itself. For the first time, he seemed to see it clearly. The dynasty's obsession with purity had instead bred weakness, and yet No decree, no tradition, no silence could undo what had already been written in the body of his son. The boy who would carry the crown also carried the burden of centuries. The twisted legs of Prince Leopold were not merely a personal affliction. They were the living mark of a dynasty's sins. Against all predictions, the infant Leopold survived his fragile first months. By the time he reached 5 years of age, he had already defied the grim murmurs whispered in the corridors. His body was frail, his legs grotesquely twisted, but his mind burned with a brilliance that startled even his most learned tutors. Languages flowed from his lips with ease, Latin declensions and Greek verses mastered in weeks rather than years. His mother, Isabella, often said his intellect seemed to gallop faster in compensation for the body that could not run. Yet this brilliance came at a cost. Each step was an agony. The palace blacksmiths crafted canes of polished oak and silver to help him stand, but even then his gait was halting, unsteady. In the eastern gardens, where he was permitted to practice away from the stares of courtiers, Leopold pushed himself beyond endurance. "I can do it myself," he declared, brushing away the hand of his governess, Countess Matilda von Essen. Trembling, sweating, he dragged his small frame forward until he collapsed into the grass, fists clenched in fury. Matilda knelt beside him, her voice soft. "There is no shame in accepting help, Highness." Leopold's pale face twisted with determination. "Father says a king must never show weakness." The words stung her. For though King Frederick had declared his son would rule one day, he rarely visited him. When he did, it was to boast of the boy's intellect, never to acknowledge his pain. The king's pride rested on Leopold's mind alone. His crippled body was a silent humiliation best ignored. It was Isabella who stayed. She became not only mother, but shield. A presence of warmth in a court that whispered cruelly. Servants, guards, even foreign envoys, they hid their pity poorly. Leopold heard them call him the crippled prince, their words slipping like knives through the tapestries. At 6 years old, he repeated it aloud to Matilda one afternoon. "They all say it, the duke's sons at the solstice banquet, the guards, even the maids in my chamber." His voice did not tremble. It was quiet, matter of fact. Matilda grasped his hands. "Cruel people exist everywhere, even in palaces. But your worth is not in your legs. It is in your courage and your mind." Leopold's eyes, an icy blue that seemed far older than his years, fixed on hers. "Mother told me why. She said my legs are twisted because our family married itself too many times," Matilda faltered. Such truths were rarely spoken to royal children, yet Isabella had refused to veil reality. Unlike Frederick, who insisted on silence, Isabella told her son plainly. The curse he bore was the direct inheritance of dynastic obsession. Better he grow with knowledge than with lies. Leopold did not weep. Instead, he straightened on his canes with dignity far beyond his years. "Then, when I am king, I will not marry my cousin. My children will be strong." Those words, spoken in the innocence of childhood, carried the weight of revolution. To reject centuries of tradition was to threaten alliances, to challenge the very pillars on which kingdoms were built. Yet they fell from his lips with certainty, as though destiny itself spoke through him. Unbeknownst to Leopold, he was rarely alone. From the shadows of the colonnades, Baron von Kleist, the king's chief advisor, often watched. Cold, calculating eyes measured the boy's every movement. To the Baron, Leopold's determination was not endearing, but dangerous. A prince who questioned the foundations of dynastic marriage was a prince who threatened the delicate web of politics across Europe. But within his private gardens, Leopold cared little for politics. Each day he rose, fought against his body, and trained his mind to be sharper than those who mocked him. By 6 years old, he had already begun to wear his deformity like a crown, not a mark of shame, but a banner of defiance. By the time Leopold reached his 10th year, the court painter was summoned to immortalize him. The portrait captured the boy's pale beauty, solemn gaze, and the grandeur of his robes. Draped velvet concealed his legs, presenting to the world an image of dignity unmarred by imperfection. The painting was carried through the corridors, admired by courtiers, and even sent abroad as proof that the von Veton line remained strong. But behind the gilded frame lay the unspoken truth. The prince could not walk without pain. The canvas became a mask, carefully constructed to protect a fragile dynasty. In the Queen's private chambers, Isabella studied the portrait in silence. Her eyes betrayed no pride, only an iron determination. She had watched her son struggle, had felt his trembling hands clutch at her own, and she knew what the painter's brush had buried. To the world, he was a flawless heir. To her, he was a boy branded by centuries of arrogance. That day, her chamberlain interrupted with news. The Austrian envoy requested an audience. Count Maximilian von Habsburg entered with the polished confidence of a man who carried centuries of power in his name. His sharp features bore the unmistakable imprint of his own inbred dynasty, the same jawline that had made the Habsburgs infamous. He bowed low, but his words were heavy with veiled superiority. "Your Majesty shines as radiantly as ever," he said smoothly. "Spare me the pleasantries, Count," Isabella replied coldly. "You did not come to admire me." The envoy smiled thinly, circling toward the window. Below, in the gardens, Leopold practiced fencing from a seated position, his sword flashing with surprising dexterity. "I bring news from Vienna," the envoy began. "My cousin the Emperor is concerned by the rumors surrounding the prince's education. Reports claim he is being taught dangerous ideas about consanguinity, which contradict centuries of dynastic tradition." Isabella's fan trembled slightly in her hand. "My son receives the finest education in every subject required of a monarch, including natural science and medicine. Yet the Emperor fears," the envoy pressed, "that your convictions are shaping him too strongly, particularly in matters of marriage." Her voice sharpened. "You mean to say that I am turning my son against cousin marriages?" The envoy did not flinch. "The Emperor reminds you that royal unions are not guided by sentiment, but by politics." At that, Isabella's composure cracked. She stepped closer, her eyes flashing. "Politics? My son cannot take 3 steps without pain. His legs are twisted into torment, and we both know why." "Must my grandchildren suffer the same curse?" The envoy sighed with exaggerated patience. "His condition is tragic, yes, but to challenge these traditions publicly would endanger diplomacy, especially as the prince's betrothal approaches." "Then I assume you have come to present the proposal," Isabella said, retrieving a sealed letter from her desk. "The Emperor offers his granddaughter, Archduchess Maria Theresa, as Leopold's bride. She is 5 years old, healthy, of noble blood." "How many ancestors does she share with my son?" Isabella asked. The envoy hesitated, then answered, 8 in the last 5 generations." Her eyes closed briefly, then opened again with steel in their depths. "Tell my cousin this. I may be a queen, but before that I am a mother. I will not condemn my son's children to the same fate." The words were more than defiance. They were a declaration of war. A quiet war, waged not with armies but with conviction, fought in shadows of courtrooms and over letters sealed with wax. Isabella knew she would face resistance not only from Vienna, but from her own husband, whose loyalty to dynastic tradition had never faltered. Yet she also knew that silence was no longer an option. History had seen queens fight such battles before. Catherine de' Medici had maneuvered her sons through the poison courts of France. Maria Theresa of Austria had clawed through endless wars to preserve her children's inheritance. Isabella now carried their torch, a solitary woman wielding the only weapon she possessed, unyielding love for her son. And so, in that dim chamber, amid the clash of duty and devotion, Isabella's vow hardened like steel. She would protect Leopold, not as a queen bound by politics, but as a mother determined to break a curse, even if it meant standing against the thrones of Europe. By the time Leopold turned 12, his reputation had begun to spread beyond Roenburg's walls. Courtiers whispered of a boy whose legs were twisted, but whose mind burned like a torch. Visitors expected to find a fragile invalid, and instead encountered a child who debated as if he were already a king. One winter morning, Cardinal Alonso Medici, papal legate, survivor of decades of intrigue in Europe's grandest courts, arrived at the palace. He had stood at the deathbeds of kings, listened to the confessions of men whose sins could curdle blood, and carried with him the weight of the Vatican's scrutiny. Yet when he entered the royal library of Roenburg, even he stopped in quiet astonishment. There, among piles of manuscripts and maps, sat young Prince Leopold. His twisted legs were visible beneath his robes, but they did nothing to dim the aura of gravity that clung to him. The boy looked up, his pale face illuminated by the weak winter sun, his eyes, icy, unflinching, locked on the cardinal's. "Your Eminence," Leopold greeted clearly, signaling to his tutor to bring him his canes. He rose carefully, each movement slow and deliberate. "I did not expect you until tomorrow's confession." Medici inclined his head. "Sometimes it is wise to arrive unannounced, Highness. It reveals what is true, not what is rehearsed." A faint smile crossed the boy's lips. "Then you find me among my truest companions. Books are far more faithful than courtiers." The cardinal chuckled despite himself. The prince's wit had been rumored across Europe, but to hear it firsthand was another matter entirely. "And what occupies you so intently today?" the cardinal asked, glancing at the open folios scattered across the desk. "Natural history and medicine," Leopold replied without hesitation. "Particularly the work of Professor Blumenbach at Göttingen on inheritance and the dangers of consanguinity." The cardinal raised his brows. "Unusual reading for a prince." "Necessary reading for one such as I," Leopold countered, tapping his cane lightly against the floor. "If I am to govern, I must understand not only politics and war, but the choices of my ancestors written in my very bones." The air grew heavier. Medici understood then why he had been sent. Rome had heard whispers that Roenberg's prince was being raised not in blind obedience, but in the dangerous light of reason. Now he saw the rumors embodied before him. "The Church teaches," the cardinal began cautiously, "that royal marriages are matters of faith and state, not medicine." "With respect, Eminence," Leopold interrupted, his voice tightening. "The Church once forbade close-kin marriages among commoners. Papal dispensations for kings were exceptions born of politics, not divine command." The words landed like blows. Medici studied the boy carefully. This was no idle complaint, but a deliberate challenge. "Those dispensations kept peace in Europe for generations," he replied. "At what cost?" Leopold's voice rose, sharp with passion. "Look at my great-uncle, who could not speak a full sentence. Look at my cousin in Madrid, whose mind is trapped in childhood. Look at me, Eminence." He gripped his canes, breath quickening, but his gaze never wavered. The silence that followed was heavy, almost sacred. For the first time in decades, Cardinal Medici did not answer as an emissary of Rome, but as a man. His voice dropped, unexpectedly gentle. "When I was your age, my younger brother was born, like you, deformed. He was the child of my father's fourth marriage to a cousin. He did not live through his first winter." Leopold froze, startled by the confession. The cardinal's eyes, so accustomed to veiling secrets, softened with memory. "Before I took holy orders, I studied medicine in Padua," Medici continued. "I learned then what you are discovering now. Blood too closely mingled brings bitter fruit. The Church knew this once, but for kings, we made exceptions. It was a mistake, one born of politics, not faith." The boy exhaled slowly, absorbing the words. "Then you understand." "I understand," the cardinal said, "and in my report to the Holy Father, I will describe you as devout, intelligent, respectful of the Church." Leopold frowned. "But we have spoken openly of reform." Medici placed a hand on his shoulder, the gesture both paternal and grave. "What you decide as king will be your choice, Highness. And should you choose to end these practices, know this. Some within the Church, this old cardinal among them, will support you quietly." For the first time, a flicker of hope lit Leopold's eyes. He bowed his head. "Then you offer me an alliance?" "I offer you time," Medici answered, his lips curving into a weary smile. "Change does not come as thunder. It falls like rain, drop by drop, carving stone. Use your years well, Prince. One day, the world may listen." In that hushed library under the gaze of saints painted long ago, a boy marked by deformity and an old man scarred by politics forged a silent understanding. It was more than an audience. It was the spark of a movement. Leopold's suffering would no longer remain personal. It was becoming a question that could shake thrones, churches, and centuries of tradition. By the winter of 1800, Roenberg lay buried under snow. Icicles clung to the towers, and the palace gardens slept beneath a white silence. Yet within the gray stone halls, a new fire had arrived, not in soldiers' boots, but in the quiet step of a young woman who carried notebooks instead of weapons. Princess Sophia of Sweden was 22, and unlike most princesses of her age, she was not known for beauty or gowns, but for her mind. Raised by enlightened tutors, she spoke 6 languages, studied astronomy and botany, and had even published scientific papers under a male pseudonym. To many in the stiff courts of Europe, she was an anomaly. To Leopold, she was a revelation. Officially, her visit to Roenburg was diplomatic, an envoy from Stockholm to strengthen ties. Unofficially, she had come because of a series of secret letters. For more than a year, she and the young prince had exchanged correspondence, protected under Queen Isabella's watchful eye. In those letters, Leopold had not written as a crippled heir, but as a fellow seeker of truth. His words were sharp, questioning, daring. Sophia, who had long believed herself isolated in her passion for science, recognized a kindred spirit. When she arrived at the library, the boy who greeted her was no longer the fragile child, whispered about in gossip. At 15, Leopold had grown into a figure both striking and tragic. His upper body was strong from relentless training, but his legs remained cruelly bent. He rose awkwardly to greet her, leaning on his canes, but Sophia halted him with a gesture. "Please, Highness," she said frankly. Between scientists, protocol may be more flexible. Leopold's lips curved into an amused smile. "You consider me a scientist? That is a title I prize more dearly than any crown." Their conversation flowed like a current. Sophia presented him with manuscripts, comparative studies of Scandinavian royal families. "Here," she explained, laying out tables and charts. "You see Sweden 3 generations ago. 2 of every 3 royal infants died before their first birthday. Now, after abandoning cousin marriages, more than 90% survive." Leopold's eyes devoured the numbers. "Deformities once common have nearly vanished," he murmured. "These statistics, they are undeniable." Unlike courtiers who cloaked their pity in silence, Sophia acknowledged his truth without hesitation. "You wrote that your father clings to Austria's betrothal contract." Leopold's expression hardened. "He is trapped between centuries. To him, blood is sacred, even when it cripples his own son." Sophia leaned closer, lowering her voice. "And your mother?" "She weaves threads in silence," he admitted. "Doctors, scientists, even clergy like Cardinal Medici. A network of minds who see what tradition refuses to see. Together, they prepare for the day I can make the change openly." Sophia studied him, admiration softening her features. "And me? In these plans, what role do I play?" Leopold hesitated, his pale face touched with unease. "Officially, you are a cultural envoy. Unofficially, my mother sees you as more, an ally, perhaps a consort, a union free from the curse of our ancestors." The words hung heavy in the air. Sophia rose, moving to the frosted window. Snowflakes drifted outside like falling ash. She spoke without turning. "So, a marriage proposal disguised as a scientific conspiracy." A faint, ironic smile curved her lips. "It is certainly more interesting than most offers I receive." Leopold flushed, his voice breaking with quiet intensity. "I did not mean to offend. I know any princess deserves a whole man." At that, she turned sharply, her gaze steady. "Do you know why I accepted this mission? Because your letters did not come from a prince lamenting his fate. They came from a man determined to transform suffering into progress. That requires greater strength than any warrior's stride." Her eyes softened, almost teasing. "Besides, Highness, your face would silence half the objections in Europe's courts." For the first time in weeks, Leopold laughed, the sound raw and bright against the winter silence. But outside the library, the mood was far from light. Baron von Kleist, the king's advisor, watched the Swedish princess with hawk-like intensity. To him, she was not an envoy, but an intruder, sent to unravel alliances carefully spun with Austria. "Do not underestimate Isabella," he murmured to Count von Brauman, Minister of Foreign Affairs. "This visit is no accident. It is part of her design." The 2 conspirators retreated to a private salon. "If Leopold rejects Austria and marries outside the bloodline, others may follow," von Brauman whispered. "Habsburg, Bourbon, Romanov. It would unravel the very system. Exactly, von Kleist said grimly. This cannot be allowed. That same night, in Isabella's private chambers, another council gathered, the Queen, her son, and Sophia. Maps and medical texts covered the table, candlelight flickering against their determined faces. Vienna grows impatient, Isabella said gravely. They propose moving the betrothal forward to spring, months earlier than planned. Leopold's hands tightened on his canes. That leaves us barely 5 months. Less, Isabella corrected. The council will press your father within the week. Once he agrees, it will be nearly impossible to reverse. Sophia's sharp eyes darted between mother and son. Then we need a counter-offensive, but words and reports take time we do not have. The Queen reached into a carved cabinet and withdrew a sealed parchment. Leopold broke the wax and read, his eyes widening. Mother, this is a plan to leave the court. A diplomatic tour of the northern courts, Isabella confirmed. Presented as trade and goodwill, unofficially, an escape. A chance to secure allies before Vienna closes its grip. Sophia frowned. Majesty, there is risk. If the prince departs now, his enemies may claim weakness, that his condition makes him unfit to rule. Silence fell. The truth of her words lingered like smoke. At last, Leopold spoke, his voice steady. Then we frame it not as flight, but as purpose. Not escape, but mission. A scientific expedition. Sophia's eyes lit with comprehension. Yes, a prince devoted to medicine, traveling to consult Europe's greatest doctors on hereditary afflictions. Who could oppose such a quest? Isabella leaned forward, hope breaking through her stern mask. It protects your claim, buys us time, and builds alliances. None of them noticed the maid standing just beyond the doorway, her ear pressed to the wood. She carried the whispers of their conspiracy straight to Baron von Kleist. The following week, in the great council hall of Roenberg, the black marble table gleamed beneath flickering torches. 12 advisors sat rigid in their chairs, their breath clouding faintly in the winter air. At the head, King Frederick VI presided, his broad frame imposing despite his gray temples. Baron von Kleist rose first, his voice smooth but cold. Majesty, I bring grave concerns. The Emperor of Austria grows restless over our repeated delays. Worse, troubling rumors suggest that the Queen and the Prince, aided by a Swedish envoy, plot to undermine the Austrian betrothal. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Some men averted their eyes. Others leaned forward eagerly. The king's expression darkened. We have intercepted letters, von Kleist continued, sliding sealed parchments across the table. Letters between the prince and scholars at Göttingen, discussing the degenerative effects of consanguinity. Reports from Stockholm whisper of secret negotiations. And here, in these very halls, conversations have been overheard of a conspiracy to defy your will. Frederick studied the papers. His jaw tightened, the silence in the chamber taut as a bowstring. You accuse the Queen of conspiracy? He asked quietly. Not treason, Majesty, the Baron replied smoothly. Merely a mother blinded by her son's suffering. But, from the far end of the table, an old voice broke the silence. Count von Richthofen, stooped with age but still sharp of tongue, spoke. And yet, Baron, do we not all see the effects of such marriages? Not only in our prince, but in half the courts of Europe, perhaps the Queen deserves to be heard. The council stilled. All eyes turned to the king. Frederick's fingers drummed once upon the marble, then he stood. Before I decide, I will hear from the Queen and my son directly. That evening, in his private study, Frederick faced Isabella, Leopold, Sophia, Cardinal Medici, and Count von Richthofen. The king's eyes were heavy, the weight of years visible in the deep lines of his face. You know what the Baron urges me to do, he began. Confine the Queen, exile the Swedish princess, and remove my son from court. But before I act, I ask plainly, what is your true purpose? Isabella's gaze did not falter. To protect our son from a marriage that would condemn his heirs to suffering, and to begin a change that will strengthen, not weaken, our dynasty. Frederick turned to Sophia. And you, princess? Sophia bowed her head, but her voice was steady. I serve science, Majesty. Sweden's records prove that abandoning cousin marriages saved our dynasty. The evidence is undeniable. And you, Leopold, the king pressed. The boy straightened on his canes, his face pale but his voice unwavering. Father, I propose a scientific expedition. Let me travel north, gather proof, and return with allies, not to defy you, but to serve our family and our kingdom's future. For a long moment, Frederick said nothing. Then slowly, he reached into his desk and produced a sealed document. For 3 nights, I have wrestled with this matter, he said, voice rough. With Medici on theology, with Richthofen on history, and with my own conscience as both king and father. This is my decision. He broke the seal and read aloud. First, we acknowledge the medical evidence regarding the dangers of consanguinity. Second, we authorize a scientific and diplomatic expedition led by the Crown Prince to the northern courts. Third, negotiations with Austria are suspended indefinitely. And fourth, from this day forward, no royal marriage in Roenburg shall occur within 4 generations of kinship, verified by a medical council newly established for this purpose. The words fell into the silence like stones into deep water. Isabella's eyes filled with tears. Sophia's breath caught. Even Medici, who had seen kingdoms rise and fall, bowed his head in solemn respect. Frederick stepped toward his son, his broad hand resting on Leopold's shoulder in a gesture uncharacteristic of the stern monarch. Your twisted legs, he said quietly, are the price of my choices, and those of my father's. I will not let your children suffer the same. Father, Leopold whispered, overwhelmed. This decree will be sealed tomorrow, Frederick continued. If the Baron and his allies cannot serve under it, they may resign. Our dynasty will endure, not because of blood purity, but because of strength born of change. The Queen's voice trembled. Frederick, you have altered the course of history. That is a king's duty, he said firmly. Then, turning to Sophia, he added, Princess, I ask you to accompany my son, not only as advisor, but as friend. He deserves a companion who sees his mind before his legs. Sophia bowed low. It would be my honor, Majesty. Outside, snow fell silently on the palace gardens. Statues of long-dead ancestors stood buried under white drifts, men and women who had clung to the myth that blood must remain pure at all costs. Now, beneath the same snow, a new chapter was being written. The crippled Prince of Roenburg would not be remembered for his deformity, but for his courage. In his twisted body, he carried the scars of centuries, and from those scars, he lit a torch. His pain became the seed of reform, a spark that promised to end the silent curse of kings.